Chapter 2: The National Differences in Political, Economic, and Legal System. What is per capita income? Per capita income is a measure of the amount of money earned per person in the nation or geographic region. Per capita income can be used to determine the average per person income for an area and to evaluate the standard of living and quality of life of the population. Per capita income for a nation is calculated by dividing the country's national income by its population. What is political economy? Political economy of a nation, how the political, economic, and the legal system of a country are interdependent. And they interact and influence each other, and they affect the level of economic well-being in the nation. What is political system? Political system, the system of government in the nation, assist according to the degree to which the country emphasizes collectivism as opposed to individualism, the degree to which the country is democratic or totalitarian. International business more complicated than domestic. Countries vary in economic development, cultural education, and skills level vary. The political, economic, and legal system are known as the political economy. Societal culture affects the political economy, and the political economy shapes societal culture.
Collectivism stresses the primacy of collective goals over individual goals. Collectivism is a cultural viewpoint that is characterized by emphasis on cohesiveness among individuals and prioritization of the group over the individual. Individualism refers to philosophy that an individual should have freedom in his own economic and political pursuits. Individualism is a political and social philosophy that emphasizes individual freedom. Collectivism versus individualism. Collectivism stresses the importance of the community, while individualism is focused on the rights and concerns of each person.
Democracy and totalitarianism. A democracy is a political system in which government is by the people, exercised either directly or through elected representatives. Meaning, ang demokrasya ay isang sistemang politika kung saan ang pamahalaan ay sa pamamagitan ng mga tao na isinasagawa ng direkta o sa pamamagitan ng mga inihalal na kinatawan. The most common form today is representative democracy. Elected representatives vote on behalf of their constituents. A democracy would not work without safeguards. The following are the safeguards of the democracies. First is on individual rights to freedom of expressions, opinion, and organizations, a free media, regular election in which all eligible citizens are allowed to vote, universal adult suffrage, limited terms of elected representatives, a fair court system that is independent from the political system, a political state bureaucracy, a non-political police force and armed service, and lastly, the relative free access to state information. Pseudo-democracies. Ang pseudo-democracy ay naglalarawan ng isang sistemang pampolitika na tinatawag ang sarili nitong demokratiko, ngunit walang tunay na pagpipilian para sa mga mamamayan. Ang kawalan ng pagpipiliang ito ay maaaring magmula sa limitadong dami ng pagkakaibang partido na karapat-dapat para sa isang boto. Mga sementadong struktura na kapangyarihan na hindi talaga apektado ng anumang boto, walang pagkakaroon ng opsyon sa pagboto or ang tinatawag na none of the above para sa mga botante na pumapabor sa pagbabago sa kasalukuyang pampolitika or the landscape, or wala talagang direktang demokratikong paraan. In pseudo-democracies, also many nations lie between pure democracy and complete totalitarianism. Authoritarian elements capture much of the machinery of states and use this in an attempt to deny basic political and civil liberties. The basic example for this is the country of Russia under their leader, Vladimir Putin. Next is totalitarianism. Totalitarianism is a form of government in which one person or political party exercises absolute control over all spheres of human life, and opposing political parties are prohibited. Meaning, ang totalitarianism ay isang uri ng pamahalaan na ayon sa teorya ay hindi nagpapahintulot ng individual na kalayaan at sinusubukang ipasailalim ang lahat ng aspeto ng buhay ng isang tao sa otoridad ng Estado. Ang totalitarianisms ay naiugnay sa isang partido na panuntunan na parehong ganap at malupit. Ang totalitarianism ay tinukoy bilang isang malakas na sentral na pamahalaan na gumagamit ng pamimilit at panunupil upang subukang kontrolin at patnubayan ang lahat ng elemento ng individual na buhay. In most totalitarian regimes, there is a widespread political repressions. There are no free and fair elections. Media is censored. Basic civil liberties are denied. Challenges to the regimes are also prohibited. The four major forms of totalitarianisms today. Four major forms of totalitarianisms today. Communist totalitarianisms. It is an advocated achieving socialisms through totalitarian dictatorship. Next is theocratic totalitarianisms. It is a political power is monopolized by a party, group, or individual that governs according to religion principles. This is mostly in Middle East. Tribal totalitarianisms. It is a political party that represents the interest of a particular tribe monopolizes power. This is mostly in Africa. The right-wing totalitarianism, it is an individual economic freedom is allowed but individual political freedom is restricted in belief that it could lead to communism backed by the military. This happens in Germany and Italy in 1930s and 1940s. Economic system. In economic system, political ideology and economic system are connected. There are three types of economic systems: the market economy, the command economy, and the mixed economy. A market-based economic system is likely in countries where individual goals are given privacy over collective goals. The state-owned enterprises and restricted markets are common in countries where collective goals are dominant. Next is the market economy. In a pure market economy, the goods and services that a country produces and the quantity in which they are produced is determined by a supply and demand. Consumers control prices and product or services quality and attributes through demand. Supply must not be restricted by monopolies.
Command economy. A command economy is one in which a central government makes all economic decisions. In a command economy, the government determines what is produced, how it is produced, and how it is to be distributed. Private enterprise does not exist in a command economy. The government employs all workers and unitarily determines their wages and job duties and product pricing. Because either the government or a collective owns the land and the means of production. It also doesn't rely on the laws of supply and demand that operate in a market economy, and it ignores the customs that guide a traditional economy. Businesses are state-owned and have little incentive to control costs and be efficient. Because there is no private ownership, there is a little incentive to better serve consumer needs. The following picture shows the 5 characteristics of a command economy. The first one, the government creates a central economic plan. The second, the government allocates all resources according to the central plan. Third, the central plan sets the priorities for the production of all goods and services. Number 4, the government owns monopoly businesses. And number 5, the government creates laws, regulation, and directives to enforce the central plan. There are many examples of command economy in history, but North Korea is still one of the examples that is currently existing. For decades, North Korea has been one of the world's most central plan economies. The US government considers North Korea's industrial capital stock to be nearly beyond repair due to mismanagement, underinvestment, and material shortages. The citizens of North Korea face starvation issue and many more. Mixed economy. What is mixed economy? A mixed economy is an economy organized with some free market elements and some socialistic elements, which lies on a continuum somewhere between pure capitalism and pure socialism. Mixed economies typically maintain private ownership and control of most of the means of production, but often under government regulation. Mixed economies socialize select industries that are deemed essential or that produce public goods. A mixed economy includes some elements of a market economy or free market and some elements of a command economy or government intervention. All known historical and modern economies are examples of mixed economies, though some economists have critiqued the economic effects of various forms of mixed economy. The number of mixed economies in the world today is falling. Number one was much greater in Latin America, Europe, and India, but recent trends towards privatization. Number two, US brought huge stakes in AIG, Citigroup, and GM in 2008 to 2010. Number three, the Russia and Venezuela increased state ownership. Legal systems. Businesses have crossed the boundaries of countries and expanded themselves across the world in search of availability of raw materials, cheap labor, talent, and market for their goods. The legal system of a country refers to the rules or laws that regulate behavior along with the processes by which the laws of a country are enforced and through which redress for grievances is obtained. The legal system of a country is significantly important to international businesses. The difference in legal systems can affect the attractiveness of a country as a market or investment site. A country's law regulates business practices, defines business policies, rights and obligations involved in business transactions. The government of a country also defines the legal framework within which firms do businesses. A country's legal system is important because laws, number one, regulate business practices. Number two, define the manner in which business transactions are to be executed. Number three, set down the rights and obligations of those involved in the business transactions. Different legal systems. Common law. What is a common law? It is a body of unwritten laws based on legal precedents established by the courts. Common law is also based on traditions, precedent, and custom. The common law system is commonly found in former Great Britain's colonies and is based on countries' legal history, past court rulings on cases, and ways in which laws are applied in specific situations. Judges in a common law system have power to interpret the law under unique circumstances for individual cases. When law courts interpret common law, they do so with regard to these characteristics. This gives a common law system a degree of flexibility that other system lacks. Judges in common law systems have the power to interpret the law so that it applies to the unique circumstances of an individual case. In turn, each new interpretation sets a model that may be followed in future cases. As new models arise, laws may be altered, clarified, or amended to deal with new situations. Countries such as United States and India uses common law systems. Civil law. What is civil law? A civil law country has a body of law that can be referred to in each individual case, and there is no such thing as binding precedent. Civil law is also based on detailed set of laws organized into codes and can be found in more than 80 countries including Germany, France, Japan, and Russia. A civil law system tends to be less confrontational than a common law system because the judges rely on detailed legal codes rather than interpreting tradition, precedent, and custom. Judges under a civil law system have less flexibility than those under a common law system. Judges in a civil law system have the power only to apply the law. On the surface seems to be more fair, but there is almost always more government involved. Theoretic law. What is theoretic law? Theoretical law are also known as religious legal systems or systems where the law emanates from text or tradition within a given religious traditions. Theoretic law is also based on religious teachings. All countries have the same blend of theoretic law and common law or civil law. Actually, many Islamic nations have legal system based on whole or in part on the Quran. Contract law. Contract specifies the condition under which an exchange is to occur and details the right and obligation of the parties involved. In a common law state, contracts are very detailed with all contingencies spelled out. In a civil law state, contracts are shorter and much less specific. The United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sales of Goods establish a uniform set of rules governing certain aspects of the making and performance of everyday commercial contracts between sellers and buyers who have their places of business in different nations. Countries that adopt CISG signal to other nations that they will treat the convention rules as part of their law. One problem with the CISG, however, is that as of 2015, only 83 nations have ratified the convention. Some of the world's important trading nations, including India and the UK, have not ratified the CISG.
Property rights. Property rights, the legal rights over the use to which a resource is put and over the use made of any income that may be derived from that resource. So, in a legal sense daw po, the term property refers to a resource over which an individual or business holds a legal title, that is, a resource that it owns. So, resources include the land, buildings, equipment, capital, mineral rights, businesses, and intellectual property. So, yung most countries have some form of property rights law. So, ito daw po yung China na adapt noong 2007. Property rights can be violated in two ways. First is private action and public action. So, yung private action po is it includes theft, piracy, blackmail, and the like by private individuals or groups. Yung biggest source of violation daw po dito is yung mafia. While sa public action po is it includes the public official extort income or resources from property holders and excessive taxation requiring expensive licenses or permits from property holders or taking assets into state ownership without compensating the owners. So, next po is yung corruption. Corruption is present in all countries to some degree. However, when a country has a high level of corruption, which is the foreign direct investment falls, international trade falls, and economic growth falls. So, yung mga businesses and individuals daw po ay nag-i-spend ng $400 billion a year worldwide on bribes related to government procurement contracts alone. And yung rankings of corruption po is by country. Is response to violation of intellectual property. Lobbying governments for better laws and enforcement of those laws. So, nakapaloob dito is yung trade-related aspects of intellectual property rights or TRIPS. It requires WTO members to grant and enforce patents lasting at least 20 years and copyrights lasting 50 years. Next one is filing lawsuits and avoiding countries with poor intellectual property laws. Next is product safety and product liability. Product safety laws set certain safety standards to which a product must adhere. Next one is product liability. It involves holding a firm and its officers responsible when a product causes injury, death, or damage. So, nakapab dito yung liability laws are usually less extensive in less developed countries. So, example dito is US has most extensive liability laws. So, the high cost of liability insurance make American businesses less competitive in the global marketplace. Next is firm must decide whether to adhere to the standards of the home country or the standards of the host country.
So, let's talk about the Leontief paradox of international trade. In economics, the Leontief paradox states that a country with a more capital per worker has a lower capital or labor ratio in exports than in imports. Vasily W. Leontief, a Russian-born American economist, analyzed the U.S. economy thoroughly in the early 1950s and concluded that the U.S. had an abundance of capital and, as a result, should export more capital-intensive items. His investigation, using actual data, on the other hand, revealed the opposite. The United States was importing more capital-intensive commodities, Vasily Leontief released the results of the primarily recognized experiential experiments in economics, an attempt to verify the reliability of the HO model using the trade patterns of the United States in 1953. The United States should have been importing labor-intensive commodities, but it was instead exporting them, according to the factor proportions theory. Because his findings were the polar opposite of what the factor proportions theory predicted, it became known as the Leontief paradox. Vasily W. Leontief attempted to empirically test the Heckscher-Ohlin theory, or which is known as HO theory, which resulted in this econometric discovery. It was calculated that a country will be more likely to export goods that make extensive use of its abundant manufacturing factors and import commodities that make extensive use of its limited issue. And also, the Leontief paradox states that countries with a lot of money buy capital-intensive items and export labor-intensive commodities. Leontief's objectives were, first, to prove that the HO model was correct, and second, to show that the US exports were capital-intensive. To determine the capital-labor ratios employed in the production of U.S. exports and imports, Leontief created an input-output table for the United States in 1947. Leontief attempted to disclose the relative factor proportion structure of the United States' contribution to international commerce in one of the most widely studied tests of the factor proportions theory. He discovered that the capital-labor ratio for U.S. exports was $13,991 per man-year, whereas the ratio for import equivalents was $18,184 per man-year. In subsequent years, economists have noted that at the time, labor in the United States was in plentiful supply and more productive than labor in many other countries. So, exporting labor-intensive goods made sense. Many economists have utilized theories and statistics to explain and mitigate the impact of paradox over the years. According to popular opinion, the United States is the only country with an abundance of capital. As a result, one would anticipate the US to export assets in the form of goods and import labor-intensive goods, which is evident. However, is that international trade is complex and is influenced by a variety of constantly changing circumstances. Trade cannot be neatly explained by a single theory, and our understanding of international trade theories is always evolving.
Types of trades. So let us define first what is trade. Trade is the action of buying and selling that involves the transfer of goods and services from one person to another, often in exchange for money. So there are types of trades to be considered. And first is the home trade. So what is the home trade? It is also known as domestic trade, in which it is an internal trade wherein the products are bought and sold only in the country. Example is the local and others that is only runs and exchange within the country boundaries. Under the home trade is we have wholesale trade and retail trade. So wholesale trade is a mode of exchange in which products are purchased and processed in large quantities and sold to resellers or retailer. Also, wholesale trade is a business activity that involves buying products in bulk from producers and selling them in smaller quantities to retailers. Foreign trade. Foreign trade is the exchange of goods and services between two countries in the international market. International trade or foreign trade is the exchange across international borders or territories because there is a need or want of goods or services. Under the foreign trade, next is the import trade. Import trade goods, services, and products brought into a country and which were bought from another country. Importing refers to the purchase of foreign products and bringing them into one's home country. Next is the export trade. Export trade is a goods produced in one country that is sold into another country or a service provided in one country for a national or resident of another country.
So these are the advantages of the international trade. So let's go first with advantages of international trade. So the first is optimal use of natural resources. International trade helps each country to make optimum use of natural resources. Each country can concentrate on production of those goods for which its resources are best suited, and wastage of resources is avoided. Second is availability of all type of goods. So means it enables a country to obtain goods which is cannot produce or which is not producing due to higher costs by importing from other countries at lower costs. The third is advantages in large scale of production. Due to international trade, goods are produced not only for home consumption but for export to other countries also. Nations of the world can dispose of goods which they have in surplus in the international markets. This leads to production at large scale, and the advantages of large scale production can be obtained by all the countries of the world. The fourth is development of the means of transport and communication. International trade requires the best means of transport and communication for the advantages of international trade. Development in the means of transport and communication is also made possible. The means of transportation and communication are called the lifelines of a nation and economy. This is because they are the backbone of the economy and hallmark of development of a nation. Transportation and communication help in the expansion of trade and boost the economy.
Much more limited and difficult to accomplish. This is because technology had not advanced enough to improve transportation methods. International trade between neighboring countries was done on foot or horseback. Trade between countries great distances from each other could only be established by boat. These voyages could take weeks or even months to complete. Today, international trade is extremely popular and much easier. The two main methods of shipping goods internationally are by air and by sea. Some international trade is still done on the ground.
The last is ability to face natural calamities. Deficiency in the supply of goods at the time of such natural calamities can be met by imports from other countries. But these natural calamities may also negatively affect trade as extreme weather events raise the cost of trade by destroying or degrading transport infrastructure and reducing agricultural production.
The following are the nature of international trade. The first one is the participation of two or more countries. International trade takes place outside the boundaries of a nation. Thus, it involves two or among more than two countries. It gives benefits to the countries which are participating in the international business. The richer or developed countries grow their business to the global level and they get maximum benefits. The developing countries get the latest technology, foreign capital, employment opportunities, rapid industrial development, etc. This helps developing countries in developing their economy. Therefore, developing countries open up their economy for foreign investments. Heterogeneous market. The language, tradition, culture, and custom, taste and preferences are different from every country's. Thus, the nature of international trade is heterogeneous. Different currencies. International trade is done among the various nations and all countries have their own currency. Then the rate of exchange of currency will also be different. Different national policies. The government policies and rules are also different at the international platform. Each country has its own policies of trade and commerce, export and import, taxation, etc. Large-scale operation. At international level, companies have to make production at large level to cover a wide market and huge demand from different nations. International business contains a large number of operations at a time because it is conducted on a large scale globally.
production of the goods at a large scale, they have to fulfill the demand at a global level. Marketing of the product is also conducted at a large scale to make them aware of the product. First, they fulfill the domestic demand and then they export the surplus in the foreign markets. The last one is the immobility of resources. The resources are immobile at international level. Resources can be easily moved at domestic level but not at international level.
Items of international trade. It promotes growth and enhances economic welfare by stimulating more efficient utilization of factors endowments from different regions by enabling people to obtain goods from efficient sources of supply. Trade also makes available to people goods which cannot be produced in their country due to various reasons. The role of trade in enhancing consumers' choice is tremendous. The foreign trade multiplier shows how an injection of income arising out of trade can lead to economic expansion.
Important basis of international trade. The basis of international trade lies in the diversity of economic resources in different countries. All countries are endowed by nature with the same production facilities. These are differences in climatic conditions and geological deposits as also in the supply of labor and capital. These differences provide a country an opportunity to specialize in the production of some specific commodities. Such specialization is facilitated by the exchange of surplus production through international trade. International trade takes place when buyers find foreign markets cheaper to buy in and sellers find them more profitable to dispose of their products than the domestic market. Thus, more effective use of the world's resources is made possible through international trade.
Stages of economic development. One of the key thinkers in 20th century development study was Rostow, an American economist and government official. Prior to Rostow, approaches to development had been based on the assumption that modernization was characterized by the Western world, wealthier, more powerful countries at the time, which were able to advance from the initial stages under development. Accordingly, other countries should model themselves after the West, aspiring to a modern state of capitalism and liberal democracy. Using these ideas, Rostow penned his classic stages of economic growth in 1960. The 5 steps through which all countries must pass to become developed. First is traditional society, precondition to take off, drive to maturity, and the last is age of high mass consumption. The model asserted that all countries exist somewhere on the linear spectrum and climb upward through each stage in the development process. The traditional society, this stage is characterized by a subsistent agricultural-based economy with intensive labor and low levels of trading, and a population does not have scientific perspective on the world and technology. The preconditions to take off. Here a society begins to develop manufacturing and a more national or international as opposed to regional outlook. Take off. Rostow described this stage as a short period of intensive growth in which industrialization begins to occur and workers and institutions become concentrated around a new industry. Drive to maturity. This stage takes place over a long period of time as standards of living rise, use of technology increases, and the national economy grows and diversifies. And the last is age of high mass consumption. At the time of writing, Rostow believed that Western countries, most notably the United States, occupied this last developed stage, where a country's economy flourishes in a capitalist system characterized by mass production and consumerism. Here, the key stages of development are related to 3 different transitions. the structural transformation of the economy, demographic transition, and process urbanization.
Environmental conditions in international trade. Trade can have both positive and negative effects on the environment. Economic growth resulting from trade expansion can have an obvious direct impact on the environment by increasing pollution or degrading natural resources. In addition, trade liberalization may lead to specialization in pollution intensive activities in some countries if environmental policy strongly differs across countries, the so-called pollution haven hypothesis. However, increased trade can in turn by supporting economic growth, development, and social welfare, contribute to a greater capacity to manage the environment more effectively. More importantly, open markets can improve access to new technologies that make local production processes more efficient by diminishing the use of inputs such as energy, water, and other environmentally harmful substances. Similarly, trade and investment liberalization can provide firms with incentives to adopt more stringent environmental standards. As a country becomes more integrated within the world economy, its export sector becomes more exposed to environmental requirements imposed by leading importers. Changes needed to meet these requirements in turn flow background along the supply chain, stimulating the use of cleaner production processes and technologies. Consequences from climate change can disrupt trade. Direct consequences of climate change on trade could come from more frequent extreme weather events and rising sea levels. Supply, transport, and distribution chain infrastructure are likely to become more vulnerable disruption due to climate change. Maritime shipping, which accounts for around 80% of global trade by volume, could experience negative consequences. For instance, from more frequent port closure due to extreme event. More importantly, climate change is expected to decrease the productivity of all production factors, which will ultimately result in output losses and a decrease in volume of global trade. At the same time, there could also be positive economic impact on maritime shipping, though the potential further opening of Arctic shipping routes, albeit at cost of environmental degradation. How can policymakers optimally combine trade and the environment policies? So the effective environmental policies and institutional frameworks are needed at the local, regional, national, and international levels. The impact of trade liberalization on country welfare depends on whether appropriate environmental policies are in place within the country in question. Stringent environmental policies are compatible with an open trade regime as they create market for environmental goods that can subsequently be imported to countries that follow suit on environmental standards, the so-called first mover advantage. This is especially true for complex technologies such as renewable energies. Countries have undertaken a number of environmental-related efforts under the World Trade Organization or the WTO framework, including negotiating tariff reductions in environmental goods and services, seeking more clarity on the relationship between existing WTO rules and specific trade obligation in multilateral environmental agreements, and seeking disciplines on fisheries subsidies. In this way, the WTO is building a multilateral framework for international trade that also discourage any misguided temptation to engage in a race to the bottom. The inclusion of environmental prohibition in bilateral and regional trade agreements has also helped harmonize environmental regulation between developed and developing countries. more advanced, economies can provide resources and institutions for capacity building and can encourage less development partners to strengthen environmental regulations. The OECD has addressed many issues on trade and environment such as environment and regional trade agreements, the drivers of environmental prohibition in RTAs, as well as the stringency of environmental policies as a driver for trade in goods and environmental goods and services. We are also currently developing a set of policy indicator or trade and environment to help monitor progress towards more policy coherence and to identify policy priorities at the intersection of trade and environment.